Today you'll be watching a presentation that I'll be sharing with students at Regis Jesuit High School in Denver, Colorado. I'm there for their Diversity Day. It's similar to our summit, and I'm one of many guest speakers. But the topic that I'm sharing in 2 breakout sessions is moving beyond marginalization, kinship, and sport. And I think it's quite fitting for our class, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks for the test run. Let me just begin with this small anecdote. The image on the right, I wanted to use this last year, and this will be relevant in a moment. Regis celebrated 20 years of girls division. So rather than going fully coeducational 20 years ago, or now 21 years ago, they added a girls division to the school. So the student population is quite large, sort of like our school. It's pretty big, and it's both young men and young women that graduate from Regis Jesuit. This is the early 2000s, and you might be able to tell by the bathing suit style, and they began with robust sports teams and programs and everything that we have at St. Ignatius. So if you were to go to their campus, I think it would be a lot like ours, and how fitting that is, right, with a shared language of Ignatian spirituality. Last year, I spoke at their conference. It was on women of wisdom. That was their focus. I don't know if you remember, but our theme last year for us was care for our common home. That's one of the universal apostolic preferences. But this year, being a good Jesuit high school, they've used a similar theme. So that's their focus for their Diversity Day. And as you may recall, ours is Showing the Way to God, and we featured a speaker, Ben McBride, Reverend Ben McBride, who talked about troubling the water as a way to show the way to God. For today's presentation, I am going to divide it into 2 just so I can upload it. I'm going to ask you to just participate as best you can. There's a couple of fun trivia questions, some ideas that we will use in our class. So let me just hit pause for a minute. Okay, so AMDG, that stands for the greater glory of God. The theme of their Diversity Day is for the greater glory of all God's diverse creation, with a very specific focus on something that we talk a lot about ourselves, which is kinship. And this quote is in part of kind of the outline, what the administrators wrote to support the ideas behind this day. And I'd actually like you to write it down, because I think we'll be speaking quite a bit about kinship, especially in the next unit. It says, to be in kinship with our community, to recognize that we, quote, belong to each other, is to recognize that we are interconnected. So those 2 ideas, kinship speaks to 1, belonging to each other, and 2, that we are interconnected. And I'd like to just share a story of how I've seen, I think this is really true. I do see our interconnection. I do see the way that we belong to each other. Perhaps you remember reading about Fran Beliebe. She was a graduate, 2019, of Regis Jesuit. What did we learn about her? Right? She became the first female high school player in Colorado to dunk the ball during a game. Now, part of me thinks about that and is like, it wasn't until 17, that a young woman was able to dunk. But I also think that's pretty cool that she was able to do it. And we as a class talked about, right, what she said about her body and the ability to jump, and the way that her hips were, women's hips are anatomically. So I didn't know that, and so it makes sense. But that wasn't her biggest, challenge, getting above the rim. It sounds like a bigger challenge for her was even being able to play basketball, period, which we're glad she did. Now, Fran went on to Stanford University. So I had actually kind of heard about her because I have friends that work at Regis Jesuit, but I also heard about her because I was aware that Stanford had gotten this player. I don't really follow Stanford. I don't really care that much about Stanford. However, they won the national championship in 2021. Now, again, women's basketball at Stanford, men's basketball at Stanford, not something I necessarily follow, That is, until there's a relationship, belonging to each other. These are two of my former students. I've talked about them. If you're on the football team, you've heard a little bit about them. On the left is Neil Begovich. On my left, next to me, is Daniel Begovich. They both went to SI, and they both went to Stanford University, where they played on the basketball team. There's our former principal. His name is Mr. Patrick Ruff. We have gone to a number of their games, like one a year, just to reconnect with Daniel and Neil. And they told me about this women's team in 2021. So I kind of paid attention. Again, if I hadn't had that connection to them, would I have paid as close attention? So often that's how kinship works. We really are connected to one another. But as a class, we saw that connection continue when we went to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Jean Luen Yang, I have a little bit of knowledge about him because of the, graphic novel or cartoon that he's done. I read a book about Bishop O'Dowd basketball. So when I walked into the MoMA, I recognized, his designs, only to see that one of the panels featured Fran Belibi, Regis Jesuit's own. Again, that sense of interconnection and belonging to one another. So not only do they tell the story of Fran at the SF MoMA, but also the history of the slam dunk, if you look to the bottom of the panel, which is pretty cool. So there we are. It's a great memory. I really think that was pretty special that we were able to go. So it turns out Fran was voted one of the top 50 most influential women in Colorado sports history. If you had asked me who is number one on that list, I would have definitely said Missy Franklin, the swimmer, another Bay Area connection, as she swam at Cal. She's a highly decorated Olympic athlete. But it turns out that it's Michaela Schifrin, who is just totally dominated in skiing and alpine skiing competitions. So in that article, you can check it out. The rankings are based off the combination of athletic achievement and impact on women's athletics. So Fran has done that in a really special way. So we celebrate her. So let's return to that idea of kinship. And I would like for you to think maybe when the first time that you heard it. I know for me, it's when we read Tattoos on the Heart. Now, it turns out that Father Greg Boyle spoke at Regis Jesuit in September 2022. At St. Ignatius, he probably came a year later or that year. But this is actually one of my favorite quotes in all of literature. I just think it is poetic and it's profound. And he speaks it so beautifully. So we're going to take a moment to read it. No daylight to separate us, only kinship. Inching ourselves closer to creating a community of kinship so that God might recognize it. Soon we imagine with God the circle of compassion. Then we imagine no one standing outside of that circle, moving ourselves closer to the margins so that the margins themselves will be erased. We stand there with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. Thank you, Father Greg, for such a prophetic message. Now, this may seem a very long-winded message or far-off message from the reality of sport. So I highlighted a few ways that I'd like for us to just think about kinship in sport. Okay, I have no one standing out that circle. No one whose dignity will be denied. We will locate ourselves with the poor, the powerless, the voiceless. No one will be demonized. No one will feel disposable. That could be in society, but sport is a microcosm of society. So our time together today, we're going to think a little bit about what this looks like in sport. And I'm going to pause here